Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me, and thank you for your patience. It's been a long time. I think the last episode was in July, and so the month of August, I needed a break, and we had to get ready for school. So school's back in session. Students are going back to their classes, and it's a good feeling to know that we're back on campus with that youthful energy, ready for another fall semester. And so I took a little pause from the podcast, but we're back and better than ever. And so I'm so glad you're listening. Thank you for tuning in. I am Dr. Leslie Joseph. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. And when we last spoke, when we were last on the podcast, we were talking about climate apartheid. It's part of our broader series looking at environmental apartheid. You know, this idea that the inequities, the inequality that we see in the environment is not by chance. It is not just an unfortunate circumstance that people are enduring, living conditions that are so bad, so awful. And, oh, it's just unfortunate that these things happen. Or, oh, well, you just happen to live on the wrong side of town. And so once you start doing better, you can move to the areas where it's more prosperous and affluent. That's not what's happening. That is not what's going on. Environmental apartheid is real, it is deliberate, and it is structured and systematized to keep certain people in certain places and to relegate certain resources to certain groups. It's not a coincidence. It is not by chance. And so we started off a few months ago at this point talking about environmental apartheid. And then what I said was there's different layers to this environmental apartheid system. It's happening all over the world. There's climate apartheid, there's food apartheid, and there's infrastructure apartheid. And I'm saying it goes under this umbrella of environmental apartheid that we see and that we have experienced to some degree, depending on who you are and where you are at some point in your life. And so the last episode was on climate apartheid. I would encourage you to listen to it. Go back and refresh your memory, refresh your mental energy to think about this topic, because today we are talking about food apartheid. I don't know where you are in the world. I don't know where you get your food. I don't know how you prepare your food and how you feed yourself and your family and your friends. But there are parts of the United States, parts around the world where food is just not accessible. It is not available. And if it is, it's the high sugar junk food variety that will only cause health problems if you continue to eat it. And so many people are dealing with the reality that they cannot get fresh food, fresh fruits, fresh vegetables. They can't prepare the food that they know is good for them and good for their families. And there's a reason for that. And I'm going to argue on the episode today that the reason is food apartheid. Food apartheid is that reason. And so please stay tuned. This is the Environmental Justice Lab. Welcome to the Environmental Justice Lab. I'm your host, Dr. Leslie Joseph. Thank you so much for joining me. And we are talking about food apartheid on this episode. We're talking about the fact that many of us do not have access to the healthy food that we need. We cannot have healthy diets. We cannot get what's needed for ourselves and our families because of food apartheid. That's why. You may have thought you just live in a bad part of town. You may have thought, oh, I just need to get a little bit more money and move over there to that other side of town where they have the grocery stores, they have all the fresh markets, they have all of the amenities that can help me live a healthier life. Let me just tell you right now 2 things about that. 1, you shouldn't have to move. Everyone, no matter where they are, no matter who they are, should have access to healthy food, to fresh fruit, vegetables, herbs and spices, all the great things that allow you to make an amazing meal to feed your family. You should be able to get that where you are. You shouldn't have to go and move your family to another part of town, another part of the city to have that access. That's number 1. Number 2, the reason that certain parts of town don't have that kind of access is not simply because it's that part of town. It's because of who lives there. It's because of the fact that we have a system in place that benefits certain groups over and above others. And if certain groups live in certain areas, those areas will be left behind, they will be abandoned, and they will not have access to what they need. That is the essence of environmental injustice, the essence of environmental racism, the essence of why there is a movement to change that. Because it's not a coincidence. It is not by happenstance that you are living in a place where there is nothing available to you. It is not by chance. And so today we're talking about the food aspects of this environmental injustice, this environmental apartheid that exists. And so for a long time, when we talked about food and lack of access, people would talk about food deserts, right? They would talk about this idea that you're living in an area where there's just nothing around. It's deserted. It's barren when it comes to food. And that's carried the day for a long time. People would say things like, hey, we need to bring restaurants, we need to bring stores, supermarkets into this deserted area because people need to have these foods available to them when they need them. And it was a good sentiment, right? It was a good idea to have that kind of framing because if you just look out, you might feel as though that's where you live. It's a food desert and we need better options, or we need some options when it comes to food. But here's the problem with the idea of a food desert. One, when you say desert, you kind of assume that it happened on its own, that it occurred naturally, right? Like a real desert is this dry, barren place where it doesn't rain and it gets hot during the day and cold at night. And it's just the way it is. And it's just a part of the environment. And so you can go into a desert and try to make it something. But if you don't, it's merely because that's just the way that area is. And that's how it's always been. Well, we know that these food deserts don't occur on their own. They're not naturally occurring the way a real desert occurs. We have food deserts because people, companies, policymakers have intentionally, deliberately abandoned these areas and moved out and away from these areas and made conscious decisions to not have stores there, to not have supermarkets there, to not have farmers markets there. That was an intentional decision, right? Based on zoning practices and zoning codes and how you lend money to companies and corporations to build their businesses and how you decide which part of town is worth investing in and making vibrant and making it an exciting place to be. These are decisions that are made by policymakers on city councils in mayor's offices, in governor's offices, in White Houses. These are decisions that are made intentionally to leave some areas with nothing and other areas with an overabundance. So let's not talk about food deserts, because it's not a desert. People live there. Their homes, their schools, their community centers. There's some parks in some instances. There's life in these areas. These areas are not these barren, desolate wastelands that people are begging to have revived, which is my second point. My second point is these food deserts are not just empty spaces with nothing. It's not. There's people there. There's homes there. There's life there. People are living their lives, raising their families in these areas. We need to put practices in place that recognize that there are people here who deserve, who are worthy of having good food options, good retail stores, places to go where they can get what they need to provide for themselves and their families. We need to think about things that way. Let's not talk about food deserts. I don't want any of you listening to come to me or anyone else and talk about how somebody lives in the food desert. They don't. They live in a part of town that has been abandoned. They live in a part of a city or a territory that has been deliberately excluded from being developed and being invested in. That's where they live. They don't live in the food desert. And so let's think about that for 1 second. There are no food deserts. There are only places where people have decided not to put healthy food stores. That's what we have. And so to combat this idea of a food desert or a low access food area, which is what the USDA would call it, the USDA being the United States Department of Agriculture, they have maps that show you where there are low access food areas. Well, that's true. They are low access, but there's a reason why. There's a reason why. It's not by chance. It's not simply because we forgot to put a store there. It's because we've made decisions not to, specifically and deliberately. And so back in the 80s, or I think the 90s, a food leader, a food justice activist, advocate, her name is Karen Washington. She developed the term food apartheid. And what she says is that food apartheid is how we can describe the structural inequalities that limit access to healthy food for low-income communities and communities of color. Right? So her point, and I agree with her point, is that the limits on access to affordable food is driven by systemic racism and discrimination and oppression. And because of that, we have higher rates of disease, chronic disease in these communities, right? You've seen the statistics. Higher rates of cardiovascular disease, heart disease, asthma, lung disease, all of these things. And it seems as though they simply occur on racial and ethnic lines. Oh, it seems like, African Americans are more susceptible to this. It seems like Hispanic Americans are more dealing with this. And it seems like, but part of it is this reality of food apartheid. The fact, and it's a fact, that we are not providing options that are healthy and that give people the opportunity, just the opportunity, to eat healthy and to live healthy lives. We don't do that. And so this food apartheid system, this food apartheid apparatus is directly harming Black communities, directly harming brown communities, directly harming indigenous communities, directly harming immigrant communities. There's no way around it. That is what is happening. That is what we're experiencing. And that is what we see, not only in America, but all around the world. Food apartheid is running rampant in our food systems. Why can't we get the food that we need when we need it? Why is it when I go teach at Benedict College, an historically Black college in the capital city, and I look around the campus, I only see dollar stores and fast food places and convenience stores. I don't have a supermarket. I don't have a farmer's market. I don't have any access to healthy food. And then we get upset with the students for eating the way that they eat. Well, what's their option? They don't have any options. There's no place to go. They don't have a vehicle. They can't just drive 2, 3, 4 miles to the nearest grocery store, even though we live in the heart of the city. Meanwhile, if I go to the University of South Carolina, a large, predominantly white college in the same city about a mile away from Benedict College, if I go there, there's a nice public supermarket that's in the vicinity. There's a Food Lion, large supermarket in the vicinity. There's a farmer's market that comes on campus every Wednesday in our vicinity. We have salad bars and healthy food places, restaurants on campus. There's no problems there. Plenty of food, plenty of access. There's no reason to say that you can't get what you need when you are on the campus like the University of South Carolina and all of that is around you. Why the difference? Why such a disparity in the two universities in the same city a mile apart? The answer is easy. It's food apartheid. And you can blame whoever you want to blame. But the reality is, decisions were made that we're going to build up and invest in this part of the city where this university is, and we're not going to invest in this part of town where this other university is. And I'm working on research now that shows the difference across this state of South Carolina, how the food environment is different around the Black colleges and universities versus the predominantly white universities. It's very clear. The data is very clear. I'm going to try to get that paper published by the end of the year. It's maddening that that's the reality that these students have to deal with. No fault of their own. You can talk about, oh, you should live here, live there, live somewhere nicer. They can't. They're just going to college trying to get a degree, trying to prepare themselves for a future. But the university and the area around it is outside their control, and they're forced to deal with what's available. And so that's a big problem. And so when you start talking to people about food and you start discussing these systems, you might hear some terms. I want you to be aware of these terms. Some of these terms are helpful. Some of them just aren't. And so I want to kind of provide these food-related terms to you just to make you aware of how the discussion could or couldn't go, depending on who you talk to. So the first one, obviously, food desert. I'm saying get rid of that term, right? The definition, the official definition, is an area in which it is difficult to buy affordable or good quality fresh food. That's the definition of food desert. I'm here to say that phrase, that term is not useful. Get rid of it. Here's another term, food swamps. I learned this term maybe about a month ago while I was doing the research. A food swamp is an area with a high density of places that sell high-calorie fast food, junk food, and other unhealthy items. Now, that term could be useful because what people might want to tell you is that, no, there are places to get food around here. There are places to go and buy healthy foods. Look, I see that grocery store there. I see that store over there. What's the problem? Well, the problem might be that there may be places to get food, but that food just isn't healthy and it just isn't good for you nutrition-wise. There's no value in it. So if you live somewhere and there's a dollar store and there's a couple of fast food places and there's a pancake restaurant and a bunch of gas stations with convenience stores that claim they sell groceries at the top of their building and they call themselves markets, well, those aren't healthy places to get your food. And so, sure, we can say that we have food around us, but it's not good food for us. And so, food swamp is that term. You should use that term when you can because I think it's a very good description of what we currently see now. We don't usually see what we used to call deserts. Deserts are places where there's just nothing. There's nothing at all. That's rare. If you go out into a more rural area, you might see that, but now it's pretty rare. What you see more often now are food swamps, multiple dollar stores, multiple pharmacies, multiple gas stations, multiple convenience stores, that kind of stuff. That's what you might see more of than anything else. So a food swamp, it's a good term. So I'm saying food desert, get rid of it. Food swamp, we can keep it. Food mirage. Mirage is pretty good. So a food mirage is an area where there are lots of grocery stores and supermarkets, but the food is too expensive for the people that live there. So this happens a lot more in the larger urban areas, big cities, where they'll bring in a fancy Whole Foods market or a really high-end grocery store to try to revitalize the area and try to bring in more affluence. And so what you'll see is people saying, hey, we are investing in your part of town. We just put this particular store there. Well, we appreciate it. However, the food that you sell is at a price point that we cannot afford. And so essentially, we are still in the same situation because you're bringing in options that we can't truly engage because it's too expensive. So it's a mirage. It's not real. It's there, but it's not available to us who don't have the resources to go to that store and purchase what we need for our family to eat well. And so it's a food mirage. And so in many cases, you might see that. You might be made aware of food mirages. I haven't lived in any. Most of the times I've seen the swamps and some deserts, some just empty places, but no mirages yet. Maybe you have. Maybe you've lived in a place where you see that really big, fancy grocery store that just came into town and you wish you could shop there, but it's just too expensive. It's just too much. And if you try to buy food for 4 people, a family of 4, you won't make it through the week. It's a food mirage. And so as a result of all those different things, our government, the USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture has these definitions of food insecurity. And so that's the more academic term that we've kind of latched on to when we talk about food. We talk about food insecurity. And so there's high food security and there's very high food insecurity. And so if you're food insecure, but it's low, then you are able to get food, but it's not the best, but you're able to manage. But you wish you had something different and more and something that's healthier. And so we will say you have low food security. You're not reducing the amount of food that you eat. It's just not very healthy food. But you're still making it through from day to day. Now, if you have high food insecurity or very low food security, basically you don't have the food you need and you can't get it. And so what they'll say is you report multiple situations where your eating has been disrupted and you've had to reduce the amount of food you eat because it's just not available. You don't have either the resources to get it or there's no place to go to purchase it. And so food insecurity is a problem. And so in the academic space, we're trying to understand it more clearly, what's causing it, how to deal with it, who's susceptible to it, all those things. And so food insecurity is a term you'll read about and that people will report on in the news, but it doesn't really tell the whole story, does it? It really doesn't. Because we don't know why any particular person is food insecure. You will say that you are, you answer the questions and we can see that you are, but why? What's behind it? Is it simply because you're poor? That's why you don't have any money? You need to get a better job, get more education, and then you won't be food insecure? It's not likely. The more likely scenario is that you live in a place that's been cut off from investment, and as a result, there's nothing there for you except the worst types of foods imaginable to purchase and eat. And so because of this, people have been fighting. Karen Washington, all these different justice organizations, they're pushing and fighting for a couple of things that I want to bring to your attention. One is food sovereignty. Food sovereignty. So food sovereignty is defined as the right of communities to control the production and distribution of their food and to define their own food systems. So they're in control. They have the ability to dictate and determine what kind of food they eat, where it comes from, and how they'll get it because they have food sovereignty. Most affluent areas, most majority white areas, they have food sovereignty. They can go get whatever they want, whenever they want, from whoever they want to get it from. It's not a problem. If I want to go to a grocery store, I'll go to a grocery store. I want to go to a farmer's market, I go to a farmer's market. I want to go to a farm and pick it myself, I can do that because I have sovereignty. I have control, complete control over how I get my food. Unlike many Black communities and many brown communities who literally have to scrounge whatever is near them and hope that there's something there they can eat, that they can feed to their families. They don't have food sovereignty. They don't have the ability to just get what they want, when they want it, how they want it. But that's the fight, right? That's the fight. We're pushing for food sovereignty. Food sovereignty. The other concept that's being fought for is food justice. Food justice. It's not the exact same thing as sovereignty, but it's very close. The idea is that when there is food justice, there is universal access to nutritious, affordable, and culturally appropriate food for everyone, while also advocating for the well-being and safety of those who are involved in the food production process. So think about that. So the justice is not just that we all have food to eat, but it's also that we're able to treat the people who produce that food with fairness, with justice and equity, as opposed to how we often do them, which is making them sweat 12, 14, 16-hour days in a factory farm to create what we want to eat, or slaving, like literally slaving, in the fields, picking all day, all night to get us the food that we need, with no rights, no living wages, no health benefits, no protection, no adherence to any safety protocols. Food justice won't allow that. So it's not just about getting the food that we can eat, but it's how it gets to us and treating those workers with the respect and dignity that they deserve because they're providing food for us to eat and for us to sustain our families. So that's what the fight is about. Food sovereignty and food justice. Now, that fight is a direct fight against food apartheid. Let's be very clear. We're not trying to simply reduce food insecurity. It sounds nice, and when I write a proposal, I'll write that in there. But the fight is against food apartheid. It's about changing the policies. It's about recognizing people as people and treating them as you should treat any person, with dignity and respect. It is not about simply trying our best to help food insecure families get whatever we can get for them. We need to. That's part of the fight, but the fight's much bigger because there are ways to help individual families make it through different difficult seasons, but without changing the way the system works and without dismantling the racist and discriminatory practices that a lot of planning committees and a lot of councils take. We'll always see these levels of food insecurity. We'll always see these levels of poor health outcomes as a result of not having the food that you need. We'll always see it. And so to avoid that, we need to dismantle this system of food apartheid, right? It's a system. It's not by chance. I'll give you an example. So I'm getting ahead of myself. In part 2, we're going to talk about specific ways that we see food apartheid. But I'll give you just a teaser. In America, we give out billions of dollars in farm subsidies to assist farmers to help them develop their land, produce crops for our food systems. Not surprisingly, the vast majority of those subsidies go to white farmers. The vast majority. Black farmers, they're out here too, doing their best on their land, trying to produce for their communities, for their cities, for the country. And they do not have the same access to these subsidies, to these government programs that these white farmers have. That's not a coincidence. That's not just a matter of not understanding the system. It's a matter of being shut out of the system completely. Because it's an apartheid system that is keeping certain people in certain places without the requisite resources to do what's needed to provide. It's food apartheid. There's so many more examples of it that we'll get into next time. But for now, just know that food apartheid is a real thing that happens all around the world. And that for those of us, if you know anyone who is struggling to feed their families, who is struggling to consistently put food on the table for their children, who is struggling to have what they need, take another look at this system that they're in and ask yourself, what's the true root cause of that inability to provide that food? I would argue it's food apartheid. Overall, it's environmental apartheid, but here in this instance, it's food apartheid. And it needs to stop. We need to confront it, call it out, and change the system so that everybody can have what they need whenever they need it. So we can have food justice for all. And that's our episode. Thank you so much for listening to the Environmental Justice Lab, where we are for the people and for the planet. I will see you next time.